הרדיו הבינתחומי.
We're very honored to have Professor Bruce Hoffman here with us today. He's the director of Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Hi, Professor. How are you today during everything that happens in Israel? I mean, being here as a foreigner, does that...
Well, it's fascinating because I think there's snatches of time when one seems to have to be on alert when you hear the sirens, when you have to take precautions. I'm teaching in a classroom that's also a bomb shelter, so we just carry on. But then you go outside, 10, 15 minutes later, it's completely normal. I think it's something that people outside of Israel couldn't understand. Firstly, the resiliency that exists here in the face of these very profound threats, but also I think a determination for people to the greatest extent possible, live their lives normally and not be intimidated, which is, of course, what terrorism is about.
Right, and you going into the subject for which you're here to actually talk about, like you've studied terrorism and counterterrorism for more than 30 years, and you've been an expert on all of those things. And obviously, the United States in the past decade has been more involved in those things and in the Middle East in generally, maybe more than it used to be in the decades earlier to that. How do you see the conflict right now between Israel and the Hamas organization in the Gaza Strip in regards to everything that's going on in the Middle East right now, with ISIS getting stronger, with Iran on its run to nuclear power and so on?
I have to say it's not completely surprising because past history has shown that one or two crises in the Middle East are then taken advantage of, especially by other non-state actors, because they have a sense of greater opportunity because of the crisis atmosphere, also because of the distraction that may be directed elsewhere, but not least because they want to steal some of the limelight or get some of the attention for themselves. So in essence, I'm honestly looking back on history, I'm not sure we should necessarily be surprised that we have so many compound problems and crises going on at one time. It's unfortunate, and I think it's a tragic commentary that the region unfortunately is becoming less stable instead of more stable. But I think what we have to wonder too and be concerned about is whether this might not become something of the new norm.
So are you afraid, or do you think that Israel is maybe facing another front, maybe from Lebanon, or maybe Iran that joining at some point in the next few months to some sort of attack against Israel? I mean, is this going to be a multi-front war for Israel?
Well, I certainly hope not. I think one of the main problems in looking at the situation in the Middle East, either now or over time, is that it's very rarely linear and also very rarely predictable, which is one of the big challenges. So I'd like to hope that this will somehow be resolved. But, the challenge is the conflict between Israel and Hamas is unfolding at a time when there's profound challenges with Iran and its nuclear ambitions that remain unresolved, which is perhaps the biggest issue. When Iraq has entered even a new era of instability and uncertainty that we have to deal with now, a Salafi jihadi state, which is enormously worrying, with the threat that poses directly to Jordan before Israel, with the ongoing civil war in Syria, which shows no resolution, instability in Lebanon, or a Lebanon ruled by a terrorist organization, by Hezbollah. And then, of course, the recent upheaval in Egypt, where the military, in essence, remains in power despite the Arab Spring, and has generated considerable discontent. So you have all these problems, which I think means that the region's likely to be unsettled for some time to come. And the danger is that these non-state groups will seek to take advantage of that opportunity to further their own goals. And that's, I think, what makes any of these crises in and of themselves serious, but also carries with them, exactly as you described, the possibility of a chain reaction or of some really dramatic and unfortunate escalation.
Right. Now, given the situation you just described with the different dangers that lie ahead of Israel, and maybe some of the challenges you just mentioned might be coming to one, and we see that the crisis in Lebanon, the crisis in Syria, and the crisis in Iraq are starting to form one type of big crisis. Giving all this into account, do you think what Israel's reaction right now is reasonable? Do you think it's good? Do you think it's going to show a future with less terror in the next few years?
Well, I mean, it's a difficult question because it's not for me, both as a foreigner and as a visitor, to really comment on strategic and tactical dimensions that I really both don't know about, but probably have a poor understanding. I think, though, what struck me, though, is that despite enormous provocation, this isn't rapidly escalating into a more serious crisis. I mean, it's very uncomfortable. It's very unfortunate that there is this ongoing threat of missile attack, for example. But it seems that there's not a finger necessarily on the trigger, as it were, that the situation is, insofar as it's possible, there's at least an attempt to stabilize it. And hopefully that will work towards diffusing that. I mean, we don't know, but I think that's exactly the right way to go.
Right. Now, you mentioned earlier that it's really hard to predict what's going to happen in the Middle East, and especially regarding to organizations that are not exactly formed as states, such as terror organizations. Do you think that Israel should have expected what's happening in Gaza? I mean, at the beginning, Israel tried to avoid a conflict, and now we're seeing ourselves getting more and more into conflict, despite the fact that, as you mentioned, the escalation is not as bad as it could have been. Mm-hmm.
It's just difficult to say because, for instance, if the Palestinian boy hadn't been kidnapped and murdered, we wouldn't be in this position. I mean, that's part of the problem, is that one incident can have a disproportionate impact with profound repercussions and even corrosive repercussions that we can't even anticipate or predict. And that's, that explains why terrorism thrives in general, why it's lasted for 2,000 years, because terrorists may not be able to take on nation states on the battlefield, but whatever stripe they are, whoever community they come from, the terrorists understand that they can have an enormously disruptive and destabilizing influence. And after all, terrorists are spoilers. They're not looking to build something. They're looking to tear something down. So they have the power to take advantage of situations and to throw it into a completely different direction that often we're powerless. And I don't think there's really any way to anticipate it, because the trouble is, I think, at a time of heightened crisis, even one incident can have a very profound impact and can have repercussions that we might not even understand at the time.
Right. So taking exactly what you just said, but putting it in a different perspective, there's a lot of talking in the international media in the past few weeks about the possibility that terrorists from ISIS or either the conflicts been going on for more than a year in Syria are going to come back with their Western citizenships back to Europe or to the United States of America. I mean, there were different numbers going on. People talked about maybe 70 people in the United States and maybe a couple of hundreds or thousand of people with European citizenship. We've seen what happened in the Jewish Museum in Bristol. Do you think that this is something that is going to become more of a threat to the Western world, to Western countries?
Well, based on historical patterns, certainly of the Afghan conflict 20 and 30 years ago, that's exactly what happened. So I think we have to take very seriously the possibility. As you described, there's already been an incident at the Jewish Museum in Brussels where someone who had fought with ISIS, a French national, came back and has carried out an attack. We already have the first example of an American citizen fighting in Syria who has committed an act of suicide terrorism. So all these, I think, are very significant data points and indications of a very undesirable potentiality that we have to take extremely seriously. And in my view, we're learning our lessons of the past decade, not to respond to the threat once it's materialized, but to be proactive, not just reactive, and to try to derail or preempt the threat. So I think these measures are very prudent.
Right. Now, one last question regarding a different conflict, the conflict in Afghanistan. How do you things come into an end, if any, with the United States involvement in Afghanistan? And what do you think the maybe one or two most important things that the U.S. need to do in order to make the what's going on right now in Iraq not a possibility or less of a possibility in Afghanistan?
Well, it's sad to say because I think we've seen the coming attraction to the Afghan movie, and that's what's happened in Iraq, exactly as your question poses it. We've seen what happens when the U.S. leaves, that after even many years spent trying to build democracy, these countries are not yet able to stand on their own 2 feet and still require at least the military support of an intelligence capability and a training capability that's not something that can be precipitously withdrawn and then expect these countries to still function normally. So if anything, I think the lesson of Iraq is that America has to leave some residual military presence in Afghanistan that's strong enough to provide training, to provide rapid intervention special forces support to the Afghan National Army and to the Afghan government, and also the intelligence capabilities that can prevent the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or the Haqqani network. Unfortunately, there's an alphabet soup of groups that are poised, and we have to be realistic, that once the U.S. goes to re-enter the Afghan space and claim it for themselves. So I think Iraq has been a very costly wake-up call, but a very significant and timely wake-up call with regard to Afghanistan.
Right. And with that note, I want to thank you, Professor Bruce Hoffman from Georgetown University, for being here with us today.
It's my pleasure.
You, and stay safe.
Thank you. You
Bye-bye.
too.